All right, everyone. I'd like to welcome you both to 2018 and to the next installment in the Chair's Lecture Series. As you know, I'm pretty sure you know why you're here and who's speaking, but I'll take a moment to introduce him nonetheless. One of our newer hires, Dr. Corwin Sullivan. You've been with us now 7 months?
Since July,
Since July. Yep, moving into the 6.5 month stage, I guess. Corwin, to give you a little bit of background on him, at least on the academic side, I don't really know that much about his personal life, so I'll stay right out of that. But Corwin did his undergrad work where he grew up, which was at the University of Victoria, in Victoria, BC. Master's degree at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, with Robert Rice. And then off to Harvard for his PhD. Was that with Farish?
It was.
With Dr. Farish Jenkins, who was a functional morphologist and paleontologist. And from Harvard, Corwin promptly went into a postdoc program at the IVPP in Beijing, or what's otherwise known as the Institute for Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology. And that postdoc turned into an appointment. And you were there 9 years, is that correct?
Yep.
I was in Beijing for 9 years. I know we have a new, a visiting researcher from China. Now, he just stepped out. I was going to have Corwin throw down his very best 9 years of Beijing Chinese, which, as I understand from him, amounted to not much, really. But either way, a year and a half ago, we had an employment opportunity come up in the department around an endowment from the County of Grand Prairie and the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum. And under the terms of that endowment, we were able to make a hire in the discipline of vertebrate paleontology, and Corwin found himself strongly attracted from Beijing to Edmonton, Alberta. Dropping probably nearly 400% in terms of population, and we only have one ring road in this city, not 5, so it's clearly a very different place. But either way, it's my great pleasure to welcome Corwin. I'll turn the platform over to him in one heartbeat. Just to remind you, the next speaker.
Yep, I think so.
Yep, she's right there. Dr. Kim Mathot, and I believe that's February 15th. We have a bit of a break between Corwin and Kim's lecture. So please make sure to calendarize that, but we'll also make sure that we've got an advertisement out well in advance so that you don't forget. And I'm going to bet it'll be something on frogs and amphibians, right?
That was the plan, yeah.
Yeah, that was the plan. Either way, Corwin, it's all yours.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Okay, good afternoon. So if you think back to the first installment back in September in this Chair's Lecture Series, it was an excellent talk by Michael Caldwell on the origin of snakes. And today I'm going to, in a sense, pick up that theme by talking about the origin and early evolution of another group of vertebrates, namely the birds. Particularly after that very kind introduction, I won't comment on which of those two groups is the more badass. My interest in the origin of birds was kindled in this building, the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology, or as we call it, the IVPP, in Beijing, which is the, as Michael said, the government research institute in China, where I spent nearly 10 years before coming here to the University of Alberta. And the IVPP, in a lot of ways, is the epicenter of vertebrate paleontology in China. They have dozens of faculty, good specimens are always coming through, and I spent quite a bit of my time there working with Chinese colleagues to describe and in some cases re-describe interesting Chinese specimens, many of which came from two particular fossil biotas, the Jehol biota and the Yanliao biota. And both of these biotas come from fine-grained sedimentary rocks that crop out in northeast China. This is the part of the country that Westerners used to call Manchuria. And they're both from the Mesozoic, the time of the dinosaurs, but the Yanliao biota is down here in the late Jurassic, the Jehol biota up here in the early Cretaceous. So they're separated by probably about 25 million years of geological time, and they're like two successive windows into the Mesozoic fauna of northeastern Asia. The Jehol biota and Yanliao biota are both characterized by exceptional preservation because they were deposited under unusual conditions, essentially forming in lakes with a lot of volcanic input. There's very good preservation of the skeletons of small vertebrates, which is unusual in the fossil record because small vertebrate skeletons tend to be delicate. There's also extensive preservation of soft tissue, including things like bits of hair on this mammal, the body outline of this lizard, but also things like insect wings and delicate plant leaves are well preserved. So these biotas give us a lot of information that we wouldn't normally get from the fossil record. So I worked on a number of specimens from these biotas, particularly ones close to the origin of birds. These are all things that I helped to describe together with different Chinese colleagues. They're non-avian dinosaurs, so close, not actual birds, but close relatives of birds. And between these descriptive projects and various other things I got involved in, a couple of papers on different aspects of anatomy in early birds, a review paper on the vertebrates of the Yanliao biota, I found it very difficult not to get interested in the origin of birds as sort of an evolutionary episode, and particularly in the origin of flight. Although more recently I've branched out and started to think more about changes in the respiratory system that also seem to have accompanied the origin of birds, or at least occurred on the line to birds. So what I'm planning to do today is to talk a little bit about, in a general way, about the impact of these Chinese specimens on our understanding of the origin of flight, as well as giving you kind of my own take on that subject based on work that I got involved in China, and then talk a bit about current and ongoing work that has more to do with respiratory changes associated with the origin of birds. So just to provide some phylogenetic context, birds are actually reptiles in a phylogenetic sense. They belong to this clade Archosauria, the ruling reptiles of which birds and crocodilians are the only living members. And archosaurs are basically divided into two major lineages. There's the Pseudosuchia, which is crocodilians and their relatives going back to the Triassic, and then the Ornithodyra, which includes, as well as birds, non-avian dinosaurs, and of course within dinosaurs, a group Theropoda containing bipedal, predominantly carnivorous forms, and it's from among theropods that birds evolved. The theropod origin of birds has been widely accepted for probably about 3 decades now. Early leading proponent of the idea that birds had evolved from among theropods was this man, John Ostrom, but of course many researchers contributed to establishing this as conventional scientific wisdom, including some guy called Phil Curry. But by about 1990, the theropod origin of birds was widely accepted, but there was a bit of a gap in the actual data regarding the transition, because although some members of theropod groups very close to the origin of birds were known, the specimens that were available tended to be quite advanced members of those groups. So they were a little remote from the actual origin of birds. And the only animal known from the fossil record that was really on the cusp of that transition was Archaeopteryx, the famous first bird or Urvogel from the Jurassic of Germany. And that paucity of data encouraged a lot of interpolation. People would come up with fairly linear and tidy scenarios about different aspects of the origin of flight that made sense to them. This is just one example, actually, from my PhD advisor, Ferris Jenkins, who postulated a fairly tidy sequence of changes in the orientation of the shoulder joint in going from non-avian dinosaurs through Archaeopteryx to birds, but This was sort of reflected a view of the origin of flight as a tidy, linear, progressive process. And then along came these Chinese fossils to complicate things. In the mid-1990s, so-called feathered dinosaurs started to appear. These were specimens of various non-avian theropods, so more or less closely related to birds, and it became clear that the ones that were a few nodes out from birds phylogenetically, sort of second cousins as opposed to first cousins to the birds, in many cases still had preserved feathers, structures that were undeniably preserved feathers, although some die-hard holdouts against the idea of a theropod origin of birds did try to deny that they were feathers. But they clearly are feathers, and what's perhaps more interesting is that they have a kind of filamentous structure. They look more like hair or bristles or like the disorganized downy feathers of modern juvenile birds than like the more planar flight feathers of extant birds that can form actual aerodynamic surfaces. So it's clear that feathers appeared fairly early in theropod evolution, but that their original function couldn't have been flight because they weren't capable of forming wings. It had to be something like insulation or like display if the feathers were perhaps colorful. But as we move closer to the origin of birds, forms start to appear that do have avian-style feathers capable of forming aerodynamic surfaces, or so-called pennaceous feathers. Archaeopteryx, an early member of a group called the Oviraptorosaurs, which is quite closely related to birds, is one example. It's a chunky little animal, about 5 kilograms in body mass, with short forelimbs that couldn't possibly have been functional volant wings. But nevertheless, it has little sheets of pennaceous feathers that you might as well call proto-wings or something similar on the forelimbs and a fan of feathers on the tail. So although this reconstruction is perhaps a bit over-exuberantly colorful, it's accurate in sort of showing the shapes of these small wings and tail fan. And there were also some forms even closer to birds, such as this dromaeosaurid Microraptor, in which the body was smaller, the arms longer, the feathers larger, and animals like this looked like they were capable of some kind of flight. And I should clarify that just for brevity, I'm going to say flight for any form of aerial locomotion, whether it's flapping flight or just some kind of gliding, moving through the air. But complications started to emerge in that this is a member of an enigmatic group called the Archaeopteryx, which are also quite closely related to birds, seemingly phylogenetically nested among forms that otherwise have pennaceous feathers, and yet the Archaeopteryx don't. Only a few specimens are known, admittedly, but among the ones we have, some of them show filamentous feathers of different kinds, but there's no evidence of pennaceous ones, so these things were presumably also flightless, as were the Oviraptorosaurs, just because of their body proportions. And I think so the feather evolution in theropods can be summarized in this way. Several fairly basal theropods had filamentous feathers, and then within the advanced clade Penaraptora, comprising birds plus deinonychosaurs such as Microraptor, the Archaeopteryx, and then Oviraptorosaurs like Archaeopteryx, pennaceous feathers were the rule, although they seem to be absent, presumably secondarily lost in the Archaeopteryx. I think, by the way, the presence of pennaceous feathers in Archaeopteryx and at least some other Oviraptorosaurs, is a bit of an underappreciated problem in the origin of birds. We have these animals that were probably primitively flightless and nevertheless had gone from filamentous to pennaceous feathers for some reason. So what were they doing with them? My favorite hypothesis, because it's eminently testable, is that maybe they were using their little proto-wings to exert small aerodynamic forces that might have nevertheless been useful in the context of terrestrial locomotion for maneuvers like braking or turning or getting over obstacles. I'm actually working on testing this together with some Chinese colleagues, including engineers at Tsinghua University in Beijing, who have built a little robot Archaeopteryx with wings that they put in a wind tunnel, and they're looking to see what aerodynamic forces the wings can actually produce. The early results are promising, but it's too preliminary to discuss in detail. And I have to admit there are obvious alternatives. Perhaps these pennaceous feathers feathers were being used in some kind of social or sexual display. Perhaps they're being used to shelter and insulate the eggs during brooding behavior. So that's an open question, but I think it's an interesting one that people don't think about perhaps as much as they should. Looking at Pentaraptoran phylogeny in more detail, it seems to be fairly widely agreed that Scansoriopterigids, Odophoraptorosaurs form successive outgroups to a clade Paraves that contains birds plus the Deinonychosaurs, which in turn comprise dromaeosaurids like Microraptor and another group called the Troodontids. And all these groups are represented by specimens from the Jehol and Yanliao biotas, and this is giving us quite a bit of information about what both the skeletons and the plumage of some of these animals were actually like. And it's turning out to be a fairly complicated picture, not least in that these specimens are providing support for an old and at first glance, perhaps seemingly eccentric idea about the origin of flight, which was that perhaps in the evolution of flight, birds passed through a stage in which they had wing-like surfaces on the hind limbs as well as on the forelimbs. So this was proposed by Beebe, or perhaps Beebe, I'm not sure how he pronounced his name, an American naturalist in 1915 or so, and this is his reconstruction of a hypothetical four-winged avian ancestor that he called a Tetrapteryx, although perhaps it should actually be a Pentapteryx, because the tail is clearly functioning here as a fifth aerodynamic surface. But in any case, this idea was proposed and then mostly forgotten until Microraptor was described, or one particular species of Microraptor was described by Xu Xing, who became probably my closest colleague in China during the time I was there, from about 2007 to 2017. And Microraptor, or this species of Microraptor, clearly has hind wings of some sort, right? Long pennaceous feathers forming aerodynamic surfaces, not just on the forelimbs, but also on the hind limbs. And it turns out that it's not just Microraptor. A couple of Microraptor's relatives among the dromaeosaurids seem to show the same thing. And then there are also a number of forms, of which the best known is Anchiornis, that are probably early members of Troodontidae, although some phylogenies would actually put them as either basal Deinonychosaurs or very basal birds. But regardless, Anchiornis also has, and some of its relatives have, long pennaceous feathers associated with the hind limbs, and there's even at least one basal bird, Sapiornis, that seems to have feathers way down here around the ankle, forming at least a modest hind wing. So this led Zheng Xiaoting, director of the Tianyu Museum in Shandong Province, and some co-authors to propose that just maybe there really was a tetrapterygian condition that birds passed through during the origin of flight, and that maybe this Paravian clade, comprising birds and Deinonychosaurs, was primitively tetrapterygian, and that the style of flight that we see in modern birds, in which there are forewings but not hind wings, actually evolved from that. However, I think there are reasons for skepticism, which I published together with Xu Xing and another colleague just last year, as part of sort of a broader review of issues around the origin of flight. For one thing, it's clear that at least in Anchiornis, in which preserved melanosomes, essentially pigment grains, have been analyzed, that the hind limb feathers were quite colorful, raising the possibility that they might have been ornamental as opposed to aerodynamic in function. Of course, the two aren't mutually exclusive, but nevertheless, this is one possible alternative function. Looking at modern birds suggests other alternative functions in that large hind limb feathers, which, as I came to realize just recently, although I'm sure ornithologists know all about this, are actually quite or reasonably widespread in modern birds, and especially in birds of prey. A lot of birds of prey have feathers kind of sheathing the leg in this disorganized fashion, presumably providing some combination of protection and insulation, but not forming any kind of coherent aerodynamic surface. Granted, the feathers that we see in specimens from northeast China do seem to form coherent aerodynamic surfaces, but perhaps that's the result of taking a disorganized feather sheet like this and compressing it between two layers of rock, right? It's hard to know. And then finally, there are many dromaeosaurids and troodontids that are clearly flightless, either because they're just so big that flight would have been implausible, or because, like Archaeopteryx here, they have rather short arms. So it seems, and these things are phylogenetically interspersed more or less with ones that could possibly have been capable of flight. So it suggests that there was a fairly complicated homoplastic picture of early flight evolution. Either it was popping up independently in different paravians, or it did evolve at the base of paraves as suggested by Zheng Xiaoting and his co-authors, but was then repeatedly lost at early stages of paravian evolution. And in fact, as far as my co-authors and I could tell from reconstructing ancestral states, it seems more likely that hindwings, in the sense of aerodynamically functional hindwings, actually evolved independently in some dromaeosaurids, some troodontids, and some birds. Or if they were indeed primitive, they had to be lost multiple times. So something fairly messy and complicated is going on. I think the issue of whether paravians were indeed primitively flightless is, so to speak, up in the air. Another complication, maybe an even more radical one, involves this animal, which is a Scansoriopterygiid that came to be called Ichi. And that term means strange wing, essentially, in Mandarin. You'll see why that's appropriate in a minute. Scansoriopterygiids are rare things. They're a bit enigmatic, and Ichi itself is known only from this one specimen, which is housed in this building, the Tianyu Museum in Shandong Province. And I first saw this thing while visiting the Tianyu Museum with Xu Xing and our colleague Jigme O'Connor, who's an expert on Mesozoic birds, back in the spring of 2014. And Xu was already working on this specimen. He'd already figured out that it was a Scansoriopterygiid and worked out a lot of things about it. But he was puzzled, and we were all puzzled, by what appeared to be two rod-like bones, not segmented or anything, just simple rods of bone, emanating from the wrists of this animal. And dinosaurs simply shouldn't have bones in that position. I mean, they clearly weren't fingers. They didn't seem to be limb bones that had been displaced from elsewhere in the skeleton and just ended up overlapping the wrists. They seemed to be rods of bone coming out of the wrists. We kicked around the idea that maybe they were some kind of soft tissue structure, but we couldn't come up with a convincing soft tissue explanation, and they just fundamentally looked like the other bones on the slab. So we kind of gave up in puzzlement and went back to Beijing and went about our work, which in my case meant working on a popular book that I was writing on Chinese fossil vertebrates, which actually came out around the time the paper on Ichi did in 2015. And in particular, I was working on a chapter of that book that was all about the evolution of flight in vertebrates. So I was reading quite a bit of stuff about gliding vertebrates and flying vertebrates. And in a textbook, I came across an interesting passage on so-called flying squirrels, which of course actually glide. And that said that the membranes of scaly-tailed squirrels, which are one particular kind of flying squirrel, are supported in part by large cartilaginous struts from the elbows. Some flying squirrels have shorter struts from the wrists. And as soon as my eye fell on that sentence about struts from the wrists, I thought back to this specimen in Shandong and thought, well, is it possible that these rod-like bones were supporting some kind of flight membrane? You know, maybe a bit far-fetched, but it actually started to seem increasingly plausible as we looked into the possibility a bit more. This is what the strut-like cartilage extending from the wrist looks like in a flying squirrel. It's called the styliform cartilage, and it's this rod which supports kind of the leading outer corner of the wing membrane there. In this case, the styliform cartilage is pretty small, but there are flying squirrels in which it's actually pretty big, sort of rivaling the forearm bones in size and comparable to what we started calling the styliform element in Ichi, just by analogy with these squirrels. Chemical testing showed that it was similar in composition to the other bones preserved on the slab, which was good because that confirmed that it was bone, or at least calcified cartilage and not some kind of soft tissue structure. And finally, Xu Xing eventually went back to Shandong, re-examined the specimen, and found what certainly appear to be bits of preserved membranous tissue associated not just with the styloform element, but also with the hand. So this was one of the possible reconstructions of Ichi that we came up with. We don't know the actual extent of the membranous tissue because only scraps of it were preserved. We don't know whether it attaches to the hind limb. We don't know the orientation of this styloform element. So there's a lot of guesswork involved here. But even a couple of years after the paper was published, we're fairly confident that the idea that some kind of membranous wing was present represents the most reasonable interpretation of the data. And that's based partly on the preserved membranous tissue, but also on because otherwise it's quite difficult to account for the styloform element itself. What else do you do with something like that coming out of your wrist? And also for this peculiar elongated outer digit, which is present in Ichi and also seen in at least one other Scansoriopterygiid. So it was known well before Ichi was discovered in this other species, and its function was always a bit of a mystery. But the membranous wing helps to explain that and explains the styloform element in a way that's actually very tidy, given what we see in some other vertebrates with membranous wings, such as pterosaurs and bats, which respectively have a rod coming out of the wrist in pterosaurs and a rod coming out of the ankle in bats that help to support the flight membrane. So it's not just flying squirrels. This is a way of supporting wing membranes that's evolved repeatedly in vertebrates and certainly seems plausible enough in Ichi. So this is an artist's rendition of Ichi gliding through a Jurassic forest. Again, details are hypothetical, but it kind of gives the idea. And this leads to a couple of further conjectures. One is that the other Scansoriopterygiid that has this unusual hand configuration with a long finger, Epidendrosaurus, may also have had at least a small membranous wing. There's no evidence so far for a styloform element in Epidendrosaurus, but it may simply have been cartilaginous in that case and not preserved, or may just have been lost from the skeleton. Secondly, there's the question of why on earth Scansoriopterygiids, or at least some Scansoriopterygiids, would involve a membranous wing when birds and their other close relatives that have experimented with flight seem to have built wings out of pennaceous feathers rather than membranes. And this ties in, I think, with the fact that pennaceous feathers seem to be absent in Scansoriopterygiids. And one plausible scenario, I think, is that they lost pennaceous feathers early in their evolution while still flightless, then experienced a selection pressure favoring the evolution of some kind of flight, and were only able to build a wing at that stage out of membranous tissue because pennaceous feathers had already been lost and simply weren't available. In any event, this really is a strange wing and seems to be an independent experiment in aerial locomotion from what other birds and deinonychosaurs were doing. So perhaps we need to think of the origin of flight as being not so much an orderly linear progressive transition, which is the way people used to imagine it, but something more like an adaptive radiation of forms that were already biomechanically sort of well positioned to evolve flight and started to experiment with different flight mechanisms and anatomical structures that would get them into the air. So that's sort of my take on the origin of flight. And recently, as I said, I've started to think a little more about respiration and about the axial skeleton and rib cage as opposed to the forelimb in birds. And modern birds, of course, have quite an unusual sort of rib cage among vertebrates. One unusual thing about it is the deep-keeled sternum, which supports those big flight muscles, but also pumps up and down as the result of rib cage movements and helps to drive air in and out of the body. The rib cage itself comprises ribs that each sort of have two segments. There's, of course, a vertebral rib, which is a normal sort of vertebrate rib connected to the vertebral column, but then there's a bony ossified sternal rib connecting each vertebral rib to the sternum. Whereas in more primitive reptiles, usually both these sternal ribs and the sternum are cartilaginous rather than ossified. So birds have evolved an unusually rigid rib cage. And another thing they've done is evolve these prongs emanating from the vertebral ribs, which are known as uncinate processes and provide attachment to respiratory muscles. The presence of the uncinate processes seems to change the mechanical advantage of those muscles and make them more effective. And it turns out, and this is sort of the point at which I got interested in respiration and the evolution of respiratory mechanisms in archosaurs, that uncinate processes are present but much less well known than they are in birds, in some other reptiles as well. The tuatara has little cartilaginous uncinate processes, similar in shape to those of birds, but cartilaginous rather than ossified. And uncinate processes have also been known for a long time, well over a century, to be present in crocodilians in the form of these broad cartilaginous tabs attached to the vertebral ribs. But the uncinate processes haven't been particularly well investigated in either tuatars or crocodilians in terms of their detailed morphology and their muscular associations and function. It's difficult to get tuataras for dissection, but getting crocodiles is not so bad. So shortly before I left China, I did dissect a couple of crocodiles together with various collaborators, including Wang Yanyan, or Yanyan Wang, who some of you may know because he's now doing his PhD with me here at the University of Alberta on the evolution of respiration in archosaurs, essentially. But in these dissections, we found that crocodilian uncinate processes look like this. They're present on the first few trunk segments attached to the vertebral ribs. It turns out that crocodilians have a bony vertebral rib and then a cartilaginous intermediate rib and sternal rib, so two additional segments attaching that vertebral rib to a cartilaginous sternum. And this was probably the primitive condition in archosaurs, sort of a three-segmented rib and a lot of cartilage rather than bone in the rib cage. But these uncinate processes look very different from avian ones. They're not slender prongs, they're these broad tabs, and even in the oldest crocodile we dissected, which was about 10 years old and pretty much an adult, they were still entirely cartilaginous. They hadn't started to mineralize or ossify in any way and were still quite pliable. This is what they look like in place. Again, cartilaginous tabs extending back from the ribs. And I won't go over what we found about their muscular associations in detail today, but it's at least plausible, based on the way they interact with the trunk muscles, that these uncinate processes have a similar function to what they seem to do in birds. That is, changing the mechanical advantage of the trunk muscles in ways that are advantageous in respiration. What I do want to talk about is the distribution of uncinate processes in archosaurs in general, which I think is kind of interesting. So bird-like uncinate processes are present, as you might expect, in a lot of Peniraptorans, which are close relatives of birds, like these Oviraptorosaurs, Caudipteryx, and Psittacipati, and also the dromaeosaurids Microraptor and Linhoraptor. They all have uncinate processes that are avian-like in being narrow prongs of bone, although unlike in almost all birds, they don't seem to actually fuse to the ribs. They just sit there next to them. A bigger surprise is that some ornithischian dinosaurs, so members of the other major branch of dinosaur phylogeny, really very remote from the origin of birds indeed, in a few cases have plates associated with the ribs that have been described in the literature as intercostal plates. And ornithischian workers have compared them to the uncinate processes of birds and found that they're very different, right? They're these broad plate-like things, and their histology also suggests that they mineralize mineralize in a different way from bird uncinate processes. What they don't seem to have done is compare them to the uncinate processes of crocodilians, and they look very similar indeed, right, except for the fact that the ornithischian intercostal plates are mineralized, whereas the crocodilian uncinate processes are cartilaginous. But they seem quite similar, and that's suggestive, if you're willing to speculate a bit, that maybe uncinate processes have quite a broad distribution in archosaurs. And this respiratory mechanism that birds and crocodilians both seem to use in somewhat different ways might actually go back to the beginnings of archosaur history. So on this phylogenetic tree of archosaurs, I've marked in red taxa that have broad crocodilian-like uncinate processes. Modern crocs, there's actually a Chinese fossil crocodilomorph that seems to show the same thing. And then a few ornithischians. And then in yellow are paravians and oviraptorosaurs, both of which have slender, ossified, bird-like uncinate processes. And based on this, and especially based on the fact that tab-like uncinate processes are present both in the crocodilian branch and this part of the dinosaur branch, maybe that kind of uncinate process is primitive. And we don't see them in most fossil archosaurs simply because they were cartilaginous in most cases, as they are in modern crocodilians. That would imply that they were still broad and cartilaginous here, and were then inherited by ornithischians, and in a few ornithischians actually mineralized. And then down here, closer to the origin of birds, they would have become ossified and reduced to these slender prongs as opposed to broad tabs. This might seem hopelessly speculative because it's relying on the presence of cartilaginous uncinate processes that you'd never see in the fossil record in a wide variety of different archosaurs. But there actually is an interest in what we call an osteological correlate of the presence of uncinate processes in modern crocodilians, and also some fossil ones like Punghusuchus here, in that if you look at the rib of a crocodilian, where the uncinate process attaches, there's kind of a broad, flat facet, which is fairly distinct. So it should be possible to look for these facets in fossil archosaurs in which the ribs are well preserved. My student Yanyan Wang and I have started to do this. We haven't found any convincing examples of these facets so far, but Yanyan in particular will be continuing the search over the coming months and years, and I'll be in a position to report back about whether this possibility of finding osteological evidence for uncinate processes in a variety of archosaurs is panning out. One final point sort of concerns the level of ossification in the rib cage that we see within Peniraptorans, right? Because birds, of course, have ossified uncinate processes, ossified sternal ribs, and an ossified sternum, which more basal archosaurs generally seem not to have had. And we see the same thing in some Peniraptorans, right? This is Archaeopteryx. It's got ossified uncinate processes, an ossified sternum there composed of two plates, a right one and a left one, and ossified sternal ribs. And this is typical of oviraptorosaurs, and it's also seen, this should say Dromaeosaurids, but it's also seen in Dromaeosaurids with the same combination of an ossified sternum, ossified sternal ribs, and ossified uncinate processes. However, there are also Peniraptorans, including troodontids and even some birds, such as Archaeopteryx and Sapiornis from the early Cretaceous of China, in which none of these structures seem to be ossified at all. They just seem to have been cartilaginous. So plotting the distribution of this extensive thoracic ossification on a Peniraptoran phylogeny now indicates that oviraptorosaurs have all three things: uncinate processes, sternal ribs, and the sternum ossified. So do Dromaeosaurids, so do some birds, but yet there are other birds and troodontids in which these things don't ossify in the slightest. Or at least there's no fossil evidence so far that they did so. Scansoriopterigids are, as usual, a bit ambiguous. One Scansoriopterigid specimen seems to show maybe an ossified sternum, but there's no evidence of sternal ribs or uncinate processes, and the identification of that possible sternum is a bit unclear. So apart from that one ambiguous case in Scansoriopterigids, these three structures seem to be kind of a package deal, right? Pentaraptorans either get all three ossifying or none at all, which suggests that you can think of extensive ribcage ossification as a distinct morphological phenomenon in these Pentaraptorans, one that may have at first appeared here and then been lost a few additional times. From my perspective, the interesting question is why it appeared. Because if you just think of this as an avian characteristic, there are ways that it could plausibly be tied to the origin of flight, right? Maybe a more rigid, better ossified rib cage is better suited to the powerful ventilatory movements you need for the energy to help sustain flight. Maybe it's better equipped to resist forces exerted on the trunk by the flight muscles, or something like that. You can come up with some functional hypotheses, except that this seems to have happened, again, at the basal Pentaraptoran node well before the origin of flight, right? And to characterize Oviraptorosaurs, which were clearly flightless, as well as some of these volant groups, and yet it was actually lost in some birds which were definitely flying. So I think the explanation for this increased ossification of the rib cage is still a little mysterious. It's something I'm thinking about and may be able to report back on eventually. But I think I certainly want to continue to work on the origin of flight, and I've maintained some connections in China. I should be able to continue working on interesting things from the Yanliao and Zhehou biotas, but increasingly I'm thinking that this stuff about ribcage ossification and uncinate process function is an interesting and much less explored aspect of the origin of birds. So with that, here's Ichi taking a bow, some acknowledgements, and thank you very much for your time and attention.
Questions?
Yes.
Are there any mutations in modern day birds that, for example, have more feathers on their legs that look like a little wing that went away?
I don't know about a little wing. I mean, there are definitely some birds that have more extensive feathering than others, and I think within both domestic chickens and domestic pigeons, there are some breeds that have very extensive hind limb feathering. I don't know of any cases in which it forms an actual little wing, and it would be, fascinating to try to make that happen, right, in a living bird.
Thanks.
Yes, Heather.
So, has your student determined the function of these broad processes in the ribs of the extant crocodilians? Are there muscles attached? Do they help the ribs compress?
Yeah, so there are muscles attached. Just from looking at the anatomical arrangement of those muscles, it looks like they could be doing basically what they're doing in birds, which is just to provide an attachment surface for some muscles and actually change the mechanical advantage of others, and changing it by increasing it. And the muscles whose mechanical advantage they seem to increase are a part of the external intercostal musculature that seems to be involved in inspiration. So it's allowing the animal to inspire more powerfully. Now, why you want to inspire powerfully as opposed to rapidly, right, which is usually the trade-off with increasing mechanical advantage, isn't all that clear.
Maybe because they're underwater?
Yeah, it could be that, or it could be that, the trunk muscles are also going to be exerting forces on the rib cage, so maybe having powerful respiratory muscles helps to overcome whatever forces those trunk muscles are exerting. It's just hard to know, but I think actually there's kind of an interesting little tangle of unexplored questions around how this respiratory musculature really works and what types of respiratory musculature, what arrangements are going to be most advantageous. Do you want it to work rapidly? Do you want it to work with a lot of power? What's actually best in functional terms? That it hasn't been thought about very much. Heather again.
My crocodilian questions. For the ancient crocodiles that were terrestrial,
Yeah.
is there any evidence that they have the rib spurs as well?
Not direct evidence, no. My sort of hypothetical scenario for uncinate process evolution suggests that they should have been present. The one Chinese specimen that shows what I think are preserved, are kind of preserved, partly mineralized uncinate processes, although they're detached from the ribs, so it's a bit hard to tell, is actually a very basal crocodilomorph, and it's from a grade of crocodilomorph evolution that's always presumed to be terrestrial. The interesting thing is that this animal also shows some evidence of at least a semi-aquatic lifestyle, so that becomes a little ambiguous. But primitive crocodilomorphs are definitely one of the groups I'm hoping Yanyan will investigate carefully to see if he can find just a few telltale scars on well-preserved ribs that would indicate that the uncinate processes were there.
Can I ask my second? Again,
Please, Heather set a precedent.
we're just going to go back and forth here. I heard that some unscrupulous people would modify fossil dinosaurs that didn't have any feathers to make them have feathers. Was that actually a thing?
Oh, yes. And all kinds of modifications were going on and are still going on to a degree. It's dealers, essentially, especially in China, that are doing these imaginative things with fossils. I think the professionals I worked with in China were pretty wise to it. And had ways of figuring out what was going on. The main one being actually that some of these fossil dealers who are doing the modifications are extremely skillful in terms of being able to sculpt materials that look like bone or paint things that look like feathers, but they don't have anywhere near the knowledge of anatomy that a professional paleontologist would. So they tend to create things that just don't look anatomically plausible. So my colleague Xu Xing in China would say that he wouldn't worry too much about looking at the texture of the bone or cracks through the specimen or things like that. What he would do would look at the combination of features that a specimen seemed to show, and if it didn't make sense, that would be the huge red flag that suggested the specimen was a fake, and then he'd look at those other things more closely.
So if you wanted to, you could live a life of crime then?
Well, I don't have the artistic talents. I couldn't paint feathers that well. I can tell you how to paint them. So if you want to team up, maybe we can figure something out.
All right then. Snacks and drinks. Thanks very much for it.
Thank you.